Okay, well, so what was the Illinois House like with cumulative voting?
The Illinois House was very chaotic. It was rambunctious. It was filled with an awful lot of characters, but it also many times had a tremendous degree of small d democracy. The best part of cumulative voting was the order to get something passed, especially something controversial, passed in the House, no matter which party was in charge, unless there was an overwhelming majority, like following 1964 with the bedsheet ballot, you needed bipartisan support. So leadership had to work with the other side. You needed people from the other party. You had to cross-fertilize. You could not pass things solely on a partisan basis. The party caucus was far less important than it is today.
Could you tell me your name and the title you'd like us to put under your name?
Oh, that should have been the first question.
Yeah.
That's okay. My name is Paul Green, Director of the Institute for Public Policy, Governor State University.
Okay. Um, could you tell me a bit more about what the minority representatives added to the Illinois House?
Freedom. They were individuals who had very little attachment to a political party. There was very little anyone could do to them in leadership of their own party. They were usually men and women of a more independent mind. Some of them were not necessarily the highest quality. Some were incredibly high quality. It was a tremendous mix. You had different types of people coming in. You had individuals that were very much policy oriented. Not that it was Valhalla, not that it was a perfect system. There were plenty of problems back then. The really important thing, though, and the most important thing of all, was that all parts of the state had political representation in each party, which meant that in order to do some major legislation, you knew that every part of the state would have someone from both political parties at least speaking for them. And the great problem with the cutback was that it has basically eliminated party representation in large chunks of Illinois in the General Assembly, in the House. The myth that Illinois is a competitive state is just that, it's a myth. Illinois is only competitive because one-party areas, when added together, create a close competition. But in reality, most of the parts of Illinois are not very competitive. So what you had then, you had Chicago Republicans representing Chicago and Springfield. You had DuPage Democrats representing DuPage in Springfield. And it was much more difficult to become a radical, one-party individual that really didn't care about what happened in another part of the state. Leadership depended on representing the whole state, because when you went to your caucus, you had people whose votes you needed who came from areas where your party had almost no political support, but you still needed that vote.
So if you could repeat the question and the answer, could you tell me what the effect then was of the cutback on?
The effect of the cutback was very simple. It simply demonstrated that one-party areas became just that, one party. It took away competition. It eventually created a system where the leadership becomes omnipotent, and given the changes in fundraising, not only did the leadership become omnipotent politically, but financially. And so today what happens, we have individuals who, many of them are just simply puppets. They sit there, they have no control over their district, they can't raise the money they need to run, they are beholden to the leadership. All they could say, the leadership never asked me to vote for anything important. I mean, you know, I'm my own person, when in reality, most of the important decisions are made in caucus. They aren't made on the General Assembly floor. There is very little House debate that's meaningful. It is no longer the kind of the protoplasm of democracy, to coin a bad phrase. There's no life there. It is simply a very dead chamber. And so we've gone from over rambunctious to a bunch of characters to really a bunch of people who sit there with their arms folded while the leaders go up with the governor and decide all the major policy. That was not the case before the cutback. There you had to go and literally deal with the opposite side. Perhaps, you know, anecdotally, the most important thing that's happened, Today it is so partisan in that House. It is so much, skins versus shirts, blue versus gray, that individuals of one party get nervous if they're even seen outside socially with members of the opposite party having dinner, where before that was part of the schmooze in which you had to, create cross-party alliances. Today, you are so nervous about being viewed as a traitor that most of the debate is already given before you even, the votes count before you go in. Very few people can survive being an independent today. Very few. Perhaps the only real types of people that could, that can go against party leadership are some of the individuals that are very close to the mayor of Rosemont, Mr. Stevens, who are able, because of Mr. Stevens' power and their own popularity, that they occasionally, as Republicans, can cut deals with Democrats. But outside of that, there are very few people that can go and work the other side of the aisle.
What's the effect on policy?
Effect on policy is that we become overly partisan, and the major decisions, which, by the way, this state has never been easy to govern. The reason Joseph Medill in 1870 brought this in the first place was because the state was not very easily governed. Many people don't realize that we had to send federal troops, Union troops were already heading to Williamson County back in the early 1860s because they were ready to secede from Illinois to join the Confederacy. There were no Republicans down there. Mr. Medill, after the election, after the Civil War, came up with this as to try and diminish some of this rampant sectionalism. Well, so this has never been an easy state, but giant policy issues today are partisan issues. There is no nonpartisan third way in the House. The Senate, which historically has been less productive than the House with coming up with innovative ideas, is now a much better debating society than the House is, because the leadership in the Senate, though it's strong to be sure, at least the senators have the ability, because of a bigger district, 4-year terms, if that's what they're in at the moment, to be a little more reflective. There's no reflection in the House. It is, if on the important issues of the day, education, budget, whatever it is, leadership puts the word out. They have their caucus, they get the party line, and no one strays. So I think major policy issues simply aren't debated in the House. You have to go to the Senate, and the Senate has never been nearly as good historically a place to air ideas as the House has.
Could you tell me the story of how we got cumulative voting in 1870?
Yeah, Joseph Medill, the editor, the founder and editor of the Chicago Tribune, realized that with the Constitution Convention of 1870, something had to be done because the state was divided north-south. South was Democratic, north was becoming more and more Republican. Chicago was a big Republican city, and Joseph Medill was working very hard to make it even more so. But he was a very, very bright man. He eventually would go on to become mayor of Chicago after this, and then, of course, realizing that being mayor was not like running the Tribune, left in the middle of his term and sailed his boat to Europe, I believe, for a little R&R. But Medill realized that something had to be done. As a longitudinal state, Southern Illinois was closer not only geographically but philosophically to Memphis than it was to the northern part. By guaranteeing representation of both political parties in all parts of the state, this was one of the ways he wanted to mitigate against this kind of rampant sectionalism. The southern sympathies of Southern Illinois were there. It was a very difficult time to govern the state, and so that was the purpose of it, was to diminish sectionalism. The irony of ironies is that over the 100 years between that, or 110 years between the 1870 Constitution and the 1980 cutback, sectionalism remained. Now, the political power base has shifted a little bit. Chicago obviously became far more Democratic. But the bottom line was that we're still the same longitudinal state, and to say we're one state, yeah, maybe on a map we are one state, but demographically, philosophically, it's very difficult to say we're one state. We are a very complicated state. We are a microcosm of America. One of the most often quoted political lines about Illinois in the 20th century is only twice in the history of the 20th century as a presidential candidate carried Illinois and not won the presidency. And that was Gerald Ford in '76 and Hughes in 1916. As goes Illinois, so goes the nation, because we reflect so much of the diversity of America. That's great, but it's a tough state to govern. What cumulative voting did was to give both parties a stake in all parts of Illinois.
Could you tell me about the 1970 Constitutional Convention?
The 1970 Constitutional Convention was probably the finest gathering of political and governmental minds in the history of the state of Illinois. It was the equivalent of the founding fathers in Philadelphia in the 1787. We never had brighter people gathered together to discuss state government. It was a magic time. The Constitution, after 100 years, was changed. There was a tremendous fight, or at least it's not a fight, at least a debate about the whole effect of cumulative voting. And it was decided by the best minds in Illinois that we needed to keep it. There are always abuses. There are always examples of individuals, talk about the West Side Bloc. Those were those Republicans on the west side of Chicago that allegedly had connections with organized crime, who voted with Democrats, and there were other kinds of things. But the notion that all parts of the state needed party representation carried the day. And if you read the minutes of the debates on the cumulative voting, it was a textbook of what we should have been doing 10 years later when we had the debate on the cutback.
Why did they make it into have to put it to the voters then?
Sure.
So we hadn't heard that.
So who really opposed it to force a referendum instead of including it in the Constitution? Who were the forces at CONCON that opposed cumulative voting?
I don't remember.
Okay.
How's that for a fair answer?
Very nice. Do you know why the Chicago Regular supported cumulative voting?
Given the time, Mayor Richard J. Daley, he truly understood. Remember, he didn't get his political career started because of cumulative voting. He went to Springfield in the 1930s as a Republican and quickly switched over to the Democrats, but he got there as a Republican. He knew very well that there were odds and ends and nuances of cumulative voting that could be manipulated. He also understood that the city of Chicago I'll start now. Mayor Daley understood that in the interest of Chicago, he needed Democrats throughout the state of Illinois. It's as simple as that. He knew his power rested on the Democratic power in the city, which still was far more formidable than it is today. In 30 years, the Democratic power in the state legislature has gone down tremendously. But Daley also understood that he had a vested interest in keeping I think he really understood that both parties needed representation. Remember, Daley was an expert on state government. People think he was only Mr. Chicago. He spent a lot of time in Springfield, budget director for Adlai Stevenson. He understood Springfield. Probably no mayor of Chicago has ever understood Springfield better than Richard J. Daley. So he understood how things worked down there. And as long as it guaranteed Democratic support throughout the state, then he was for it. He also didn't particularly want to risk redistricting. Remember, Illinois didn't redistrict for 55 years. I mean, other parts of the country talk about it. We don't even talk about it. We just didn't do it. And he was always worried that Chicago would lose its support. The irony of ironies is that when the state stopped redistricting, Chicago was growing. When the state started redistricting, Chicago's population was declining. Bad chain of events. Daley wanted to preserve Chicago's power, and he thought under cumulative voting, given the power as being the #1 Democrat in the state, he could influence other Democrats throughout the state, throughout the legislature. If, in fact, you go to single-member districts, he knew parts of Illinois would be wiped out of all Democrats, and he was proven absolutely right.
So do you think Daley was right in his political calculations?
Yes. He was very seldom wrong when it came to understanding the political machinations of Chicago's relationship to Springfield. His only real blind spot was not recognizing the power, till very late in life, the power of the surrounding suburbs as they were growing. And I think that also was a great fear. He died. He really, from 74 on, he was not the man after his stroke that he was beforehand. But he understood very clearly. Remember, in Springfield, his people there was a young Mike Madigan, a young Richard J. Daley, plus other people who were a little older. I mean, and they were up there with Dawn Clark Netsch, and there were a whole bunch of people down there who were speaking for different parts of Chicago. But Daley understood the basic principle is that a political party needed to be represented everywhere. And this was the only way Democrats could ever be represented everywhere, was through cumulative voting.
Do you think in Illinois there's a lot of sort of establishment Illinois support for cumulative voting?
I think there's a lot of support for cumulative voting. Some of it's nostalgic. Some of it is just a gut reaction against what we have now, and some of it is based on policy. You do not have individuals there who can speak openly on an issue that goes against perhaps the party leadership. The first job I ever had dealing in government was I worked for then a relatively young state representative, then Anthony J. Scariano, and from Park Forest. Tony Scariano, who went on to become a noted jurist and now is retired and basically trying to make Italy the 51st state. But Tony Scariano literally called his own shots. He literally called his own shots. He spoke out openly, fearlessly on a whole bunch of issues. If it went against the party, it went against the party. But he was out, he was in there. Everyone knew that he had no real great political future outside of being a state rep. He could not run for state senate, which was proven when he tried and got clobbered. He could only be a state rep under cumulative voting. He had no political future. Therefore, he was policy oriented and he could take positions, sometimes with the party, sometimes against the party, or sometimes bring up issues that had neither party. And so you had people down there, as Tony used to call it, the kosher nostra, Abner Mikva, Paul Simon, Tony Scariano, individuals who were Democrats who were more liberal perhaps, but certainly far more independent. There were conservative Democrats who were independent. There were liberal Democrats who were independent. There were liberal Republicans like Elroy Sanquist from Chicago. Nothing the Republicans could do in Chicago could stop Mr. Sanquist. And you had conservative Republicans being elected. So you had philosophy on all sides of the party because you can get elected as a minority in each of these districts. Today, they're much more cookie cut than they were then. So you don't have the Scarianos, you don't have the Aaron Jaffes on the Democrats, you don't have the Abner Mikvas, you don't have the Paul Simon, blah, 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 blah. And on the Republican side, you don't have the Chicago Republicans like Pete Peters and Elroy Sanquist, individuals who, literally had nothing to fear about taking an opposite view from their party leadership.
And they made for better policy?
They made for policy discussions. They could bring up things. Now, they don't always win. In fact, sometimes they almost always lost because the so-called establishment party leaders in both parties may gang up against them. But they would raise the level of debate. Even as chaotic, and believe me, if you were down there to see 177 people, some of which who had social behavior that probably was not necessarily Emily Post, going at each other, people screaming and yelling and jumping up and down, occasionally throwing things at each other, jumping up and stopping the clock on June 30th, not realizing that in the good old days, Paul Powell controlled the clock when he was a leader from a bathroom on the second floor. I mean, we're not talking Athens under Pericles here, let the record show. I mean, I'm not trying to paint this as this was just simply a pristine avenue of democracy, but it was contentious to be sure, but it was open. And I think that's the thing that we missed the most. The thing that bothered me most about the advocates of the cutback amendment was their hypocrisy. Almost everything they said, the opposite was true. They said the cutback amendment would create more competition. It created less competition. They said the cutback amendment would save money. It costs money. Almost no one got fired, and almost all those legislators that were cut out found other jobs, and government bureaucracy just became inflated. They said that there would be less bills introduced. There were more bills introduced. I mean, every single major issue that they raised was proven wrong. And perhaps the worst part of it was that they said there would be, the citizens would know their representatives. They would be far more philosophically in tune. What we have is that in one-party areas, the Republicans have to go way to the right to get elected because they're so fearful of a party challenge because they know they have no general election challenge. And the Democrats, the same thing. You go much to the left. Under cumulative voting, you had far more people getting elected in the middle. We have lost a lot of moderates in the General Assembly, and I think that's a big loss for the state.
Could we talk a bit, let's talk about the campaign itself a bit more of 1980.
Yes.
How did this happen?
Well, Pat Quinn and manipulating the media, as he's very good at, got this on the ballot, and there were committees formed on both sides. Debates were held throughout the state. I was part of the anti-cutback group, and I was involved in series of debates with often against League of Women Voters, who were, as a big supporter of the League, this was one time that they were way off base. And we would have these debates. Some were very well attended, some were sparsely attended. Remember, this was also the time when you had a big challenge for president. You had Kennedy against Carter in the Democratic Party, Reagan against Bush in the Republican Party. And so it was a very political time, and so space was not necessarily, a lot of space wasn't given to this. But there was a lot of energy. There were commercials cut on radio. And this was a time in which, you know, the idea of cutting back, getting rid of those politicians, saving money, it was a very difficult thing to overcome, because in order to discuss cumulative voting, it doesn't lend it, to be for cumulative voting doesn't lend itself to a soundbite, doesn't lend itself to a 30-second commercial. To be against cumulative voting made it very easy to be, you know, for a 30-second commercial.
What would your best soundbite for cumulative voting be?
Well, obviously, I wasn't all that successful. When I would debate, the most important thing I think I said, if I said anything important, was, as I said before, the proponents are simply misrepresenting what's going to happen. I try to paint a picture, and I have to say this time I was right, of a much more rigid, closed General Assembly, and that we would have, I think I used the phrase, the General Assembly would be dominated by party leaders, because party nomination now would become far more important. We now have a primary-driven House of Representatives and General Assembly. Most of these people elected in this state, the only time they are in trouble is in the 2 elections following redistricting. The new district and their challenge in the primary. After they win that first primary, unless they stray from the party line, they're good for 10 years. That's wrong.
Last question, could we talk a bit about the drawbacks of cumulative voting?
Sure. Drawbacks are very simple, and that's one of the reasons we got in trouble in the first place. It's confusing. 3 votes for 1 person, 1.5 votes for 2 persons, 1 vote for 3 persons. I loved it because people had to think about it. Another drawback, of course, is that you had, well, also a plus, it's a plus and a minus. In a one-party area, where you had 2 people running from the same party, both of whom were going to guarantee to win, there was great intra-party competition as to who would lead the ticket of those 2, because that would be the person that would be the dominant legislator and the person who would probably be the most likely to go on to a higher office. So when they talked about bullet voting, where you voted 3 votes for 1 person, most bullet voting occurred between parties. I mean, you had some of the best party competition in your life between 2 candidates in a one-party area from that same party trying to outdo each other. It wasn't 1 for all and all for one. It was 3 for 1 and none for you, which I find very refreshing. Some people thought it was undemocratic. Some people thought it was much too manipulative. But the other big thing, of course, is that you had a bunch of characters down there. They were unruly at times. A lot of them didn't come with the best intentions, because you had so many. It was crowded. It was noisy. And many people never understood the system. Cumulative voting could never be a fill-in-the-blank answer, because no one could, it's an essay test, not a fill-in-the-blank test. And so the notion of simplifying it, one-on-one, one of the big things that the opponents would say, this would create a one-on-one political contest, which sounds great on paper, except most of the states, most of Illinois, it's one-on-none. There's no competition. So but cumulative voting was I believe the word is mishmash. And yet today you see some of the so-called leading theorists coming up with all kinds of proposals that are basically cumulative voting. All this proportional representation, all the other stuff, is really an offshoot of what we had in cumulative voting. So it was much more difficult to explain, and certainly if you went down there, it did look like, instead of going to Springfield at times, you were going to Brookfield Zoo. I mean, no doubt about it. On the other hand, it was a democratic zoo. Today, it's not very democratic at all. Much more pristine, much more polite, and not a very exciting or I believe, deliberative body.
Could you give us like a 15-second biography? We're going to do a voiceover introducing who you are.
Paul Green, Director of the Institute for Public Policy at Governor State University, BA University of Illinois, MA PhD University of Chicago, former elected official in beautiful Monee Township in Will County, 1977 to 1983. I was a township official, a township supervisor during this cutback amendment debate. One of the reasons I was quite active was because I was an elected official, and because my first boss, Tony Scariano, was leading the anti-cumulative voting, the pro-cumulative voting forces against the cutback. So he enlisted me into the great battle. But, and I've been teaching for 25, almost 28 years now, 25 to 28 years, because I was a short interim, state and local government.
Does you have a chance to say anything?
No, I only just asked a couple points. If it's to be restored, do we keep the same size legislatures? And that's sort of a problem. We get a bigger district now, but you had a really maybe one of the would be less chaotic if it was smaller, but you would have bigger districts. So what do we do about that issue?
One of the great problems of trying to restore cumulative voting is that it's got to be a constitutional issue, because I think the law is if you add seats, it's got to be done through constitutional means. In other words, you just can't redivide the state legislature and put in cumulative voting.
It's okay.
I do think cumulative voting, I forgot the question.
What's the question of having the same size legislature we have now?
Right, I know. I think we would have to find a very delicate way of doing it. I think one of the great problems of reintroducing cumulative voting is to come up with a procedure and a process by which we can do it. To make a House district larger than a Senate district does not make much sense. To make the Senate district and the House district coterminous makes a great deal of sense. If we went back to cumulative voting, if we had 59 Senate seats, do we take the House and we split, to go back to the way we did it? Another way is, why don't we take a Senate district and divide it up into thirds? And then we'd have 3 single-member districts in each Senate district. Well, I don't like that either, simply because that probably would just create an extension of what we have now, non-competitiveness. My big view is we have to find a way, if we can't create inter-party competition, we have to find a way to create intra-party competition. We just need competition in politics. And we need to find a way to bring in people into the legislature who are policy-driven, not political-driven. Obviously, everyone now is a politician, but we need people whose focus goes beyond simply wanting to look at the next election. The key is to find a method, and it's not going to be easy, in which we create more competition in the state of Illinois. We are becoming a less and less competitive state. We are basically, in many parts of our country, Soviet Stalinist Russia had more competition. We have to get away from that.
Thank you. So please state your name and the title you'd like underneath your name.
Okay, it's Arthur L. Berman, B-E-R-M-A-N. I am Illinois State Senator.
Wonderful. I understand you served in the Illinois House. Please tell me when you did and what that was like with cumulative voting.
I was first elected in the election of 1968 to the Illinois House of Representatives. I served from 1969 through 1976, 8 years in the Illinois House. I then, in 1976, ran for and was elected to the Illinois Senate and have served there since. I am serving my 30th year as we speak in the Illinois General Assembly, 8 years in the House. This is my 22nd year in the Illinois Senate. I am the longest serving Democratic member of the Illinois General Assembly.
Wait for just a second. Go ahead, your next question.
So what was it like, what was the House like when it was elected under cumulative voting?
Well, first of all, let me point out that I have always been elected roughly from the same area, although there's been a number of redistrictings in the 30 years that I've been in the General Assembly. I represent the far north side of the city of Chicago and the close-in suburbs of Evanston and Skokie. And that's been the area that I've represented for all these years, give or take certain boundary lines. When I first ran for the Illinois House, we had cumulative voting. What that involved was 177 elected representatives serving in the Illinois General Assembly. There were, as there are now, 59 state senators. So each district, there were 59 districts, both in the Senate and 59 districts in the House. In the House, however, each district elected 3 legislators. Usually, with a few exceptions, 2 were elected from the majority party of that consisted in that district, and 1 minority party. For example, in my district, it is substantially a Democratic district. It has always been substantially a Democratic district. So that in those days when I would run, there was usually 2 Democrats elected from that district and 1 Republican. That, I think, is a very interesting point. And in my district, it was a little even more unique from this point of view. Being from Chicago, and back in those days of the late 70s, late 60s, early 70s, we had what some people like to call the Democratic machine, with a structure of precinct captains and ward committeemen that were on a daily basis throughout the year working elections. Even when there weren't elections, they were working elections. They were servicing the people. The suburbs didn't have the machine. They had more of a volunteer basis of operation. In the 1972 election, that would be 4 years, the election 4 years after I was first elected, as a result of the 1970 map, my district was redrawn so that what was in 1968 and 1970 elections, totally within the boundaries of the city of Chicago, the new map in which was involved the 1972 election included part of the city of Evanston for the first time in its reapportionment. So we had in the primary of 1972 a contest. We had 2 incumbent Democrats from the city of Chicago and 1 challenger Democrat from the city of Evanston. And that was a hotly contested race. Evanston was new into the district. There was a non-incumbent who was running for a seat. There were 2 incumbents from Chicago, one from the west side of the district called the 50th Ward, one from the east side of the district called the 49th Ward. Those were 2 incumbents. I was one of them. And the 3 of us ran for what was going to be elected 2 spots. It was a very hotly contested race. As it turned out, the incumbent from the 49th Ward lost, I won, and the gentleman from Evanston won. We ran in November, and we were elected and served as representatives of the far north side of Chicago and part of Evanston. So in those days, though, and there was a Republican who was elected also. I think there may have been 2 Republican nominees, but in the November election, what you had were 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. When you walked into the voting booth, above each name, and this gets a little complicated, and that was one of the downsides of cumulative voting. Above each person's name, in November, for example, you would have 3, now you'd have 3 punch holes. You could give 3 votes for 1 candidate. You could give 1.5 votes for 2 candidates, or 1 vote each for 3 candidates. That was what they meant by cumulative voting. I could give what we used to call a bullet vote, 3 votes to the candidate that best represented me, for example. I'm Joe Voter, I walk in, I'm a very liberal Democrat, And when I looked at all the names, I would like to give all my 3 votes to the most liberal candidate of those 3 or 4 candidates running for 3 spots. So I could give 3 votes. And that's what made the difference many times in the election process because of bullet voting. If you could organize your voters to give you 3 votes and everybody else was all spread out with 1.5 or 1 vote, you could get a select group of your constituents who could really re-elect you, and they were only a minority of people in your district. Now, I hope I've explained what that process is adequately, but now, as effective as that may have been to the average voter, it was confusing. In a primary, there could be X number of Republicans running for 2 Republican positions. Same thing with the Democrats. So you had a contest, but you could vote cumulative voting in the primary. 3 votes, 1.5 votes for 2, 1 vote for 3. Or you go to November and you could vote for 1 vote for each of the 3 candidates that you wanted to represent you, a Republican and the 2 Democrats. Or in some Republican areas, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And in a few districts that were overwhelmingly of one party, once in a while you would find that they would elect a 3rd candidate of a majority party. They may not even have run under that label, but people knew that that was what was going to happen. But that was rare. But going back, what you had, and in my district was one of the best examples of it. Because of what I'll call an independent Democrat from Evanston, a person who has grown up in the Democratic organization, sometimes referred to as the machine, in Chicago. I was the machine candidate. My other Democrat was the independent candidate. He got endorsed by the IVI-IPO back in those days, and a Republican candidate. So that virtually regardless of what your political philosophy was, living in my district, you could vote for the, quote, legislator who's going to best represent me, unquote, because you had the choice of a Republican, an independent Democrat, a machine Democrat. It covered the whole spectrum of representation.
Neat. Let's talk a bit about so what were the pluses of this process?
Well, the pluses of that process, even though it's complicated, just explaining it is complicated, was that throughout the state you had majority party representation and minority party representation. For example, in the city of Chicago, let us say that there were 15 districts that were from Chicago, 15 out of 59, or it may have been 20 out of 59, but let's say 15 out of 59. In each of those 15 districts, because it was from Chicago, you had 2 Democrats, but you had 1 Republican. So that from Chicago, you had a representation of 30 Democrats and 15 Republicans. In the process of the operations of the General Assembly, of the House of Representatives, and in both houses, Senate and House, but you have caucuses. What that means is that the members of a party meet behind closed doors. It's not a public meeting. The press is not available. The public cannot come in. But it's a caucus meeting. That means that all the members of that party go behind closed doors to discuss issues. How are they going to vote on X or Y or Z? And they decide what they're going to do. When under cumulative voting, where you had 15 Republicans representing the city of Chicago, when the Republicans in the House of Representatives would have a caucus, 15 people representing a third approximately of the city of Chicago were in there to voice Chicago's point of view. Today, you have, I think, physically located in Chicago, only one Republican senator or two Republican representatives, virtually none, which means that in the Republican caucus in the House, there is no one to speak for the voters of Chicago in that caucus. That makes a big difference. We had some outstanding Republican representatives who spoke very eloquently on behalf of their Chicago interests. One of the names that comes to mind is Arthur Telkser. He was an assistant leader in the Republican caucus. He was from the mid-north side area along the lakeshore. When he went into that caucus, we knew that Chicago's interests would be voiced. We may have different points of view, but from a locality point of view, from a regional point of view, having him there and his colleagues who were also Republicans elected from Chicago, and let us say from DuPage. We had Democrats that were elected from DuPage. Today, you have virtually no Democrats elected from DuPage because of its strength as a Republican stronghold. Shouldn't Democrats who live in DuPage have a voice in that caucus, in the Democratic caucus, that if there's a legislation that's going to affect the people of DuPage, shouldn't they have a voice? That's the beauty of the cumulative voting process, is that everyone had a voice, Democrat or Republican.
In Chicago, why didn't the Democrats go for all 3 seats?
Because you found that in even in heavily Democratic areas, like mine, which was a heavily Democratic, the people understood that it's supposed to be 2 and 1, that the Republicans should have a voice, or the non-Democrats, whatever you wanted to call them. And there were people that didn't want to be identified necessarily as either Democrat or Republican. You might call them independents, you might call them free thinkers, whatever you want to call them. They wanted to have someone other than the Democratic machine, for example, to represent them. So that's why you had 2 and 1 in a few districts, and you could, I would say it was 1, 2, maybe 3 districts. Because of the overwhelming, and when I say overwhelming, I'm talking about 90% plus of Democrats, the Democrats could elect 3 who were Democrats, even though they might have run under the Republican label. But that was unique. Out of 59 districts, if you had 1 or 2, maybe you'd have that. But other than that, what you had was 2 of the majority party and 1 of the minority party, and that's what applied statewide. So out of 59 districts, control was also determined in a way that, depending upon whether you had 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans elected from a district, and you started to add up who was elected in each of the 59 districts throughout the state, sometimes it was very late into the night or sometimes very late into the week to determine who controlled the House of Representatives because of this 2 majority, 1 minority party being elected in each of the districts.
Do you think that was a good thing?
I think it had its pluses and it had its minuses. Let me address what I think was its minuses. It was confusing. People walked in, especially if they didn't pay any attention or good enough attention, they didn't know what that was all about. And I'm not sure that they voted as it was intended from the point of view of giving 3 votes or 1.5 votes or 1 vote. But it was confusing. That was a downside. Should people have known it? Yes. Could they have learned it? Yes. So assuming that that's the offset to the confusion, yes, they could have learned and used it appropriately. The very big plus, in my estimation, was that you had minority voice. And not only partisan minority, such as Republicans from Chicago or Democrats from DuPage. You also had philosophical minorities. people that were elected who were able to organize a relatively small percentage of the total voters. And because of bullet voting, 3 votes for a single candidate, arithmetically, you could put together 11%, call it 12%, 12% of the electorate. If I represented a district that had 100,000 people, all I would have to do is to organize 12,000 of those 100,000, and if I could convince those 12,000 to give me a bullet vote, 3 votes, when, assuming everybody voted, which is a hypothetical, but for purpose of our illustration, if all 100,000 people came out to vote, but my 12,000 voted 3 votes for Berman, those 12,000 very well, by giving me 3 votes, gave me 36,000 votes. The other 88%, if they spread out among a number of other candidates, I would be elected by appealing to only a 12% minority in my hypothetical district. Is that good or is it bad? I guess it depends upon whether you agreed with the person that was elected or not. But I remember that there was some, I will say, outrageous legislators with, no, let me correct that. There were some legislators with outrageous ideas who were elected through the cumulative voting process, that were elected and voiced their outrageous positions on the floor of the House. Was that bad? I don't know. Was it good? I don't know. But they had a voice. And also what that process lent itself to was that because I could hypothetically go to a minority of people to get reelected, I had a greater control over my destiny than if I have to be centrist and get 51% or 50% plus 1. What does that mean in the operation of the House? It means that the leadership, the people that were the speakers of the House or minority leaders in the House, didn't have the strength under cumulative voting process, the strength of control of their membership that exists today. Some people, some political scientists that would look at it would say this is a better system today because you have more control. Others would say no, it was a more small d democratic process, a more free-thinking process, a more responsive process to the needs of the minority people throughout the state through a cumulative voting process. But there was a substantial difference under cumulative voting versus the present traditional voting method.
If you could take a pause.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. One of the pluses of the cumulative voting process was that in order to get elected, you didn't need 50% of the voters plus 1 to vote for you, because cumulative voting allowed each voter to vote a bullet vote, 3 votes, or 1.5 votes for 2 people, or 1 vote each for 3 people. What that resulted in is that if you could concentrate your strength among a relatively small portion of your constituency, and that constituency all came out and gave you the 3-vote bullet, you had a much easier approach to being elected through that method. I can't tell you what the numbers would be, but it certainly doesn't have to be 50%. It might be 33%, it might be something even smaller. And when you look at any particular election, especially today with the low turnouts, especially in primaries and in Novembers, you could very well be talking about a very small portion of voters who could be appealed to. And you're seeing that even today. in certain areas where, for example, the far right is well organized, much better than the far left and the centrists, where they come out and vote and they elect their people. With cumulative voting, it would be even easier for them to elect their people. But that applies across the board. The people that participate will elect their candidates. With cumulative voting, they have even a better chance of electing their candidates.
Great. Could you tell us a bit about why we lost cumulative voting?
The proponent of the constitutional amendment was very adept in reaching out to the media and to the general public and saying that by voting yes on this constitutional amendment, you'd be firing 59 politicians. And they also raised the spectrum of saving, and I think the number was something like $7 million of the state budget by eliminating 1/3 of the membership of the Illinois House of Representatives. The public liked that pitch, save tax dollars, and fire 59 politicians. It passed. It required a 60% vote on the ballot. It got more than a 60% vote on the ballot. And therefore, the 177-member House then became a 118-member House. The $7 million was never saved. But 59 politicians, elected officials, lost their jobs.
And cumulative voting kind of went out on the side. It was kind of behind this reduction in the legislature. It was possible to reduce the legislature size, increase the districts, and not lose cumulative voting. It really wasn't about cumulative voting in this particular election.
Well, the problem and where the issue of cumulative voting was raised, the simple response to the proponents was, it's so confusing, we ought to abolish it. And as I've indicated with my explanation, it is confusing. It has pluses, it has somewhat of a minus, but because it was confusing, it wasn't a hard sell to abolish it.
Were you involved much in the 1970 campaign?
Constitutional amendment?
Yes.
Or
Convention.
convention? I was a close observant. Interestingly, the gentleman that ran with me in 1968 for the House, both of us were elected from our Democratic district. He ran and was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1970. He was a very smart, very articulate spokesman, and he was one of the leaders in the convention. So I observed, because of my closeness to him and my interest in what they were doing, because as an elected official I wanted to watch what this constitutional amendment convention was going to be proposing. I took great interest in what the constitutional convention did.
How did cumulative voting get retained in 1970? What forces supported retaining it?
Well, I think that again, it was a process of that we knew what we had. You had a majority of people in the legislature that had been elected under that system, and this is a very important political point. When you propose changes in an elective body, you have an uphill fight, because if it's a dramatic change, the people you're appealing to, namely the incumbent legislators, are people that were elected in a different way than what you're proposing. So that they very well may be very apprehensive against supporting your proposal, because they know they were elected under the old system. They're not sure what's going to happen to them under the new system. So selfishness, personal interest prevents a change. And that's, in effect, what happened. It really, I don't recall to the extent of the debate, but the 1970 convention didn't change it.
Do you remember, we understand that a lot of the
Democratic regulars supported retaining cumulative voting when it came time for the referendum. Do you remember if that's the case, and if so, do you know why they did?
Well, again, I think that one of the reasons was because, A, we were incumbents. B, from the point of view of watching population shifts, people leaving Chicago, moving to the suburbs. If you had cumulative voting, the suburban people, so to speak, that moved to Lake County, DuPage County, Will County, Democrats would have a voice out there in cumulative voting process. If you eliminate cumulative voting, and what happened was that your Democratic legislators from those areas that were substantially Republican then and are substantially Republican today wouldn't have any Democratic voice. Also, the flip side is that Chicago had a voice in the Republican caucus under cumulative voting. We had virtually no voice in the Republican caucus after the elimination of cumulative voting.
So, thanks, that's very good. Could you tell me a bit about what the House is like after 1980?
Well, I think what we have seen from the changes is that because of elimination of cumulative voting, what we have now is, for example, we have 59 Senate districts and you have 118 House districts. Under my Senate district, there's a House district to my north, on my north half, and a House district on my south half. I have 2 state representatives elected from separate districts within my Senate district. So there's 59 Senate districts statewide, 118 House districts. Each one of those House members underneath my Senate district, so to speak, have to receive a 51% vote to represent their district, just as I have to get a 50% plus 1 vote to represent the Senate district. That means that they are more centrist. They have to their electorate. They can't be far out, otherwise somebody will run against them and beat them. That's just the process when you have the normal election process. So also because of that, and you have to appeal to a greater number just because of the arithmetic, what we have seen is that the leadership, the Speaker of the House for the majority party and the minority leader for the minority party in the House has greater strength today than they had under the cumulative voting process. Because under cumulative voting, again, to be elected, I only had to appeal to a much smaller number of my voters to give me the bullet vote, that 3-vote process. And I didn't have to reach out, perhaps, to as many people. I didn't have to raise the kind of money that I have to raise today to run for an election. In the Senate, and it's not equal to the House, but in the Senate in 1994, the Senate, one of the Senate races just to the north of me, the 2 candidates there raised and spent $1.5 million in the Senate race. Now, if you go back in history, when you had cumulative voting, when you had 177 members of the Illinois House, that $1.5 million probably would have covered 2/3 of the elections instead of just one district. So the cost of elections has risen. The control of the leadership has risen. The far out effect or the far out ability of candidates has dropped. That doesn't mean that that's good or bad. A lot of people want a centrist candidate, depending upon the district. Well, that's fine, and that doesn't detract from it, even under cumulative voting. But the beauty of cumulative voting, or one of the aspects of it, which may not be beauty, is that you can appeal to a smaller number and still get elected.
Can we zero in on the thought or the idea that by having to reach out to more people, the cost of campaigns increase?
Well, there's, for example, when you talk